Great. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining this workshop where we're going to talk a little bit about how we can really build a feminist anti-war movement. So my name is Carly Town. I am with CODEPINK, and I'm going to be talking through a number of things that we work on today. So, I really created a workshop that's going to be a little bit interactive as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about three things. So one, talk about CODEPINK as an organization and how we build a feminist anti-war movement. And then we're going to talk about two of our campaigns and some of our successful strategies within those campaigns. So we have a movement to cut the Pentagon for people, peace, planet, and a future. And then I'm also going to talk about our Divest from the War Machine campaign in more detail as well. So in between each of those, we're going to have some time to chat and talk. So if there's any questions or comments or thoughts that people have while I'm talking, please jot them down, think of things, and we can talk about them in between each presentation. So without further ado, I'll just go ahead and get started to make sure that we have time to go over everything. So again, we're just going to be talking about building a feminist anti-war movement. Just quickly, like I said, I'm Carly Town. I'm a national co-director at CODEPINK, and I work on our Divest from the War Machine campaign and our Cut the Pentagon for People, Peace, Planet, and a Future campaign. And, my contact information is right there. If anyone has any questions or wants to contact me, I'm always open to chatting. But let's talk a little bit about CODEPINK as an organization. So CODEPINK is a women-led grassroots organization working to end U.S. wars and militarism, but also to support peace and human rights initiatives and redirect our tax dollars into, healthcare, education, green jobs, housing, and basically anything that's life affirming. And at this point, right, something that can help address climate change. And this is something we're going to talk about in way more depth. So, as many people might have guessed or noticed based on my background and our name, right? CODEPINK is not just our name. We also use the color pink in all of our work, our activism, our protest signs, and our creative protests whenever we show up. But people might not know that, the reason why we're called CODEPINK, right, is because CODEPINK was founded in 2002 during the lead up to the US invasion in Iraq. And the name CODEPINK played on the former Bush administration's color-coded Homeland Security alerts. So if people don't know, President Bush would say, code yellow, code orange, code red, in terms of like national security warnings that signaled quote unquote terrorist threats and their level. So, while the Bush administration's color coded alerts were based on fear and obviously hate, and were used to justify extreme violence, the CODEPINK alert is more of a feisty call for peace. And instead of waging war, it's a call to wage peace, right? So, since our inception, the goal of CODEPINK has always been to juxtapose warmongering and profiting from war and death with a call for peace. And like I said, we do that obviously with the color pink, but, we're also showing up in pink because, it's a color that is a little bit more disarming, right? It's kind of playful and it's meant to evoke a positive feeling in a way that a lot of these spaces and a lot of these discussions around war and militarism, of course, center on some really serious topics. And so we try to bring some levity into those spaces. And you can see some of the places where we've brought that, right? I mean, here is our another national co-director of ours, Ariel Gold, who disrupted a presentation being held by Airbnb because we were calling on them to get out of settlements. And then on the right, here's a gathering just of local CODEPINK members around the United States. They gather, show up at protests, but also work to organize around, these important topics of peace and reinvesting in what we actually need. So, besides just wearing pink, although there's still a lot of pink in this photo, right? Another like really trademark tactic of Code Pink is to use, clever wordplay and also like visually appealing tactics to obviously gain attention to a topic that's not often discussed in our media, in our local media, within the American consciousness, really at all, right? A big part of the anti-war movement is the fact, in the United States particularly, is the fact that many people just feel like US's ongoing wars don't really affect them. So we have to find a way to bring that into the forefront of people's days. And we do that by bringing really creative protests directly to them, right? So, here you can see during the Bush administration that Code Pink members would show up to protests wearing, they're called pink slips, calling for President Bush to be pink slipped, which is like get fired. And the same wording was used to create a huge pink slip banner. It's kind of hard to tell how big this is just from this photo, but you can see that it's spanning 3 stories. And it was promptly taken down by security, but photos were captured, it was in the press, and people were talking about why this pink slip was being demonstrated. And it was all because we were drawing attention to the fact that Bush lied us into the war in Iraq. So obviously, President Bush is no longer our president, right? And so beyond the Bush administration, Code Pink has become a worldwide network of people committed to working for peace and social justice. And we've become, like I said, kind of noteworthy for confronting the warmongers within the halls of power, right? Which includes anywhere they are, whether it be at a luncheon, somewhere where they're getting an award, or right in the halls of Congress, or at the conventions of the Republican National Convention, the Democratic National Convention, basically anywhere they are, we try to get access to and disrupt them, right? And creating clear visuals that make war crimes visceral in a way that numbers and statistics maybe can't, right? So you'll see here, right, here's one of my favorites where protesters had bloody hands and a clear sign in front of Henry Kissinger, right, saying war criminal and calling attention to all of the blood that's literally on his hands, even though he was called to testify as an expert in Congress. So then, another thing I wanted to address, which I think is really important part of our movement, is that Code Pink is a feminist anti-war organization, right? And we're feminists for a lot of reasons, and we're women-led very deliberately, right? So, I mean, of course, first off, I think it's really important to remember historically, right, that the movement for women's liberation, especially in the United States, came out of the anti-war movement, right? Came out of work to protest against the Vietnam War in the United States. So that's where many of the leaders in the women's liberation movement actually came out of and really learned some of their organizing tools. But also, second, in the lead up to the war in Afghanistan, politicians and the media were using quote unquote women's rights as justification to lead us into war, saying that US intervention would improve women's rights abroad, right? People might remember this, or people might have heard this conversation, especially when the US withdrew from Afghanistan just earlier this year. People all of a sudden wringing their hands, worried about women's rights, but refuse to talk about the fact that the United States has been bombing and killing people in Afghanistan, right, for the past 40 years, right? So that's really important. And then you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, right, one of Code Pink activists there confronting US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in the halls of power, bringing attention to the blood on her hands for justifying and leading the United States into endless wars and the war on terror, right? So very deliberately and clearly saying it doesn't matter if a woman is leading the war machine or, the Department of Defense, in this case, she's Secretary of State, because what matters is how our policies are affecting women and children around the world, right? But also, and, this is something that's coming up quite often now as we move into, the 2020s and a lot of focus is on more women in STEM, more women in these fields that more often than not go directly into the companies that create the weapons of war that we protest, right? There's a lot of like quote unquote feminist discourse around women advancing in the workforce and STEM, right? So I wanted to include that in this conversation as well. If you can see on the top left-hand corner, this is a PR piece, like a piece that was run in Forbes magazine, I think, and it's talking about commanders in chief, the women building America's military machine, right? And it's couched in this language of women's empowerment. They're breaking the glass ceiling, right? And that's why it's incredibly important to have a feminist and anti-war movement coming together, because we need to be able to speak back to that really false feminist discourse that says that women who are at the top of the US war machine are somehow good for women's empowerment, right? And so, this is also why at CODEPINK, if you see on the right-hand corner, we work to build out a vision for a feminist foreign policy, right? Which rejects this idea that what we need is more women controlling the military apparatus in the United States. And instead, right, and this is a quote from our website and from our work, which is, we imagine a future without foreign coercion and without the exploitation of working people and natural resources around the world. And an anti-capitalist critique is at the heart of our feminist agenda for global justice, right? So we reject the idea that someone like Marilyn Hewson, who is a CEO of Lockheed Martin, is part of our feminist movement, right? So the last thing I wanted to do was just show, just over the years, we have some really great disruptions that have been caught on video. So actually I wanted to show a couple of those here. I don't think we can do some of our disruptions justice without actually seeing them. So let me go ahead. I'm just going to share my screen one more time with this YouTube video. So give me 1 second. Okay. Hopefully people can.
Actually, the woman is Medea Benjamin, co-founder of the anti-war protest group CODEPINK.
Some in Washington should spend more time responding to the warnings of our commanders on the ground and less time responding to the demands of MoveOn.org bloggers and CODEPINK protesters.
We saw every night CODEPINK activists inside the convention hall and only a feet away from the speaker.
CODEPINK traveled to Charlotte after protesting at the Republican National Convention in Tampa.
Time to get corporate money out of politics, and it's time to end the wars abroad. We need to hold the Obama administration accountable for all the wars that he is perpetuating.
What about the hundreds of innocent people we are killing with our drone strikes in Pakistan and in Yemen and Somalia? I speak out on behalf of those innocent victims. They deserve an apology from you, Mr. Brennan. Well, how many people are you willing to sacrifice? Why are you lying to the American people and not saying how many innocents have been killed?
Great. So that's just, a handful, and I can send folks that video. So yeah, that was just, I wanted to do sort of an in-depth introduction to CODEPINK and some of our work over the years. And I wanted to see if there's any questions or anything before we move into our first discussion of more of a substantive conversation of some of our ongoing campaigns and work at the moment. So any questions or thoughts? I wanted to open it up for people. All right. Let me go ahead and share my screen. One moment. Okay, so like I said, I wanted to talk about this particular campaign that we have ongoing right now. Like I've said, it's called Cut the Pentagon for People, Planet, Peace, and a Future. It's something that we started on September 12th, so the day after the 20th anniversary of 9/11, as a way to set a different course forward, right? The United States was ending the war in Afghanistan, although we're continuing military operations there, right? And so we're trying to look for a way to bring movements together and chart a different course beyond what the United States has had for the past 20 years, the war on terror, right? And as someone like me who grew up in the shadow of the war on terror, it's sometimes hard to sort of imagine a world where we're not perpetually at war, where we're not perpetually spending huge amounts of our federal budget on the Pentagon budget. So that's where this sort of campaign enters, and that's what we're trying to build as we speak. So I wanted to start off, I mean, maybe people here know this, but I always find it to be very shocking, and people who I talk to are always shocked by this. So I'm wondering if people have any thoughts like about the United States Pentagon budget and just the sheer size of it. So the Pentagon budget is larger than the next blank countries combined. So what do people think? You can put it in the chat box if you want. You think it's larger than 5 countries combined, 11 countries combined, the next 8 countries combined, 14 countries combined? Okay, Natalia said D. What do other people think? How large is the US Pentagon budget? I wouldn't be surprised if it's D. Okay. Jonathan, me neither. Okay. Okay. It's not D, but it is B. So it's larger than the next 11 countries combined. And that, let me show you what that looks like. The Pentagon budget is larger than the next 11 countries combined. And if you look at that, right, this shows just a couple of the countries that that includes, right? But in particular, right now, if people have been watching or have seen what's going on in the United States at the moment, our representatives are really using this like inflated and false threat of China as a reason why we need to keep increasing our Pentagon budget, to quote unquote keep up with and compete, quote unquote compete with China, right? But if you look at the fact that the United States Pentagon budget for the year 2022 is likely going to be $778 billion, which translate to over $1.5 million a minute we will spend on the Pentagon budget. You compare that to all these other countries, China, India, Russia, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Germany, and there's others below. You compare all of that and you see just how ridiculous those claims are, right? Okay. So I just wanted to give people another sense of what our budget actually looks like and how that compares also to other spending in the United States, right? So a lot of numbers kind of float around about what the US spends on the war, on war and the US military. But what does that, really include, right? So these figures are from 2019, but, I just wanted to go over them in a little bit more detail. So it's true that the Pentagon budget is just a portion of our total militarized budget in the United States. So we have what's called the Department of Defense, right? But the United States spends much more on other things that we would consider as part of the militarized budget within the United States, right? So you can see kind of like this breakdown over here, right? So if you see Department of Defense, Pentagon, that makes up the majority of our spending, right? But then we also have a Department of Veterans Affairs, and then what's called the Department of Homeland Security, which includes the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. So that's how the United States militarizes our immigration system, and then immigration and customs enforcement as well. So you'll see that the Pentagon budget is the largest part of our militarized budget in the United States. But if you just compare our militarized budget to what we spend on everything else, you can see how large of a portion we dedicate to our military every year. And it's honestly shocking, right? So, that's why we focus on in Code Pink on the Pentagon budget specifically. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about placing our current Pentagon budget within the context of historical military budgets in the United States, right? So what do people think on this one? Also, if you just want to answer in the chat. So the current Pentagon budget, which is shaping up to be $778 billion this year, or for 2022. The current Pentagon budget is larger than levels during the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Reagan buildup in the 1980s, or all of the above. So again, right, ostensibly, the United States just ended the war in Afghanistan, drawing to a close the sort of endless war on terror. Seems like that would be a really great time to cut our Pentagon budget, right? And reinvest in more like peace initiatives, right? However, that's obviously not the case. Eleanor, D, I'm prepared to believe the worst. Okay, other folks? Natalia said, oh, all of the above. It's not a huge test or anything, but okay. It looks like people are sort of leaning towards D, all of the above. I'll give you one more second to see if you have any.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was D, because everything is always more expensive than last year.
Yes. Okay. Well, it turns out everyone here was correct. Unfortunately, taken together, we spend more on on our Pentagon budget than we did at the Vietnam War, Korean War, and what we refer to as the buildup during the Reagan years, right? So you can see our current spending here. This is just as a percent of our GDP, so you don't need to worry about that. But you can see current spending now, right? The only other time where it peaked larger than what we're currently spending is during World War II, right? So that is quite shocking, right? And after the end of World War II, you can see a sharp increase in military spending, which has not dipped below spending levels in the post-war period of the 1950s, right? So it's truly shocking. So after World War II, sharp decline, but ever since we've had a very steady increase, which has not ended, right? And I think that's really important for us to understand too, because for a lot of people, like I said, especially my age, who really grew up where the war on terror was just something that was part of our everyday lives, you would think like, oh, this is just normal, right? This is normal that we're spending this much money. This is just how it's always been. But if you take a look historically, that's just not the case, right? So that I think that's incredibly important. But another thing that I think is important for us to understand is what we actually spend our Pentagon budget on, right? What does it actually look like? What are we spending that on? So $740 billion, that's how much our Pentagon budget for the year 2021. That $778 billion number is what's expected for 2022. So if you take a look at our Pentagon budget, you'll see that we'll spend over $1.5 million a minute on the Pentagon in 2021, but half of that budget, half of that spending will go directly into private military contractors, including companies which people are probably familiar with, like Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing. And I think this is also incredibly important, right? When we looked historically at how much we spent on the military over the years, right? It's also important to put into context what we're spending that money on now and how that compares to past military budgets, right? So this figure that we spend over half on private military contractors represents an incredibly enormous increase in spending on private companies since 2001. Right. And this is a trend which our friends at the Cost of War Project at Brown University has dubbed the rise in the, quote, camo economy, or the commercialization of our military forces. Right. So the increased portion of that budget going directly into the pockets of private companies that are enriched from the Pentagon budget. So that's incredibly important. Another aspect of the budget that I really wanted to focus on as well, that I think people maybe also outside of the United States don't know, is that we dedicate so much of the Pentagon budget to creating and maintaining weapons that the US military sends, quote unquote, excess military grade weapons to local police forces through what's called the 1033 program. So you can see this is not something that has gone away. This is actually a photo from summer of 2020 during, racial justice uprisings around the country. And you can see this is a local police force. This is not a military, in another country. This is within the United States as well, right? So the 1033 program was created in the 1990s during the United States, quote unquote, war on drugs, and has since transferred over $7.4 billion in excess property that we know of to local police forces. And that includes the weapons that you see in that photo, right? The tanks, the large armored vehicle, guns, all of those things, right? So I think that's really important for us to understand as well. But then another aspect of our military budget that we have to understand is that this issue is closely related to our discussion around climate change. And this goes to your question too about how do we create a stronger anti-war movement, and to us and other peace movements within the United States, at least, we're really working to create a clear and strong connection to the climate justice movements, because our movements are intimately connected and we have to show how they are, right? So, something that's happening right now in the United States is that we have to be able to distinguish between several arguments that are being made about climate change and the Pentagon budget, right? So on the one hand, right, the connection between spending on the Pentagon budget and climate change is being made clearer and clearer every day, right? Militarism and the climate crisis are deeply intertwined and mutually reinforcing, right? So you can see in this graphic from the National Priorities Project, the US has spent $6.4 trillion on war in the past 2 decades. And that obviously has meant that we're not spending that money on things like renewable energy, right? The cost of shifting our national power grid to 100% renewable energy over the next decade would only be $4.5 trillion, right? So while people claim that we just can't afford to spend these things on things like renewable energy, we clearly can, right? And we would have money to spare. And also, right, something that's incredibly important that we always try to speak to is the fact that the US military itself is a huge polluter, right? And is often deployed to sustain the very extractive industries that destabilize our climate, right? People know, right, that the United States obviously goes to war in order to protect or gain access to natural resources that destabilize our climate, right? Like oil. And it's really important to also note that this climate chaos in turn leads to massive displacement, militarized borders, and the prospect of further conflict, right? So when I say that climate change and US militarism are deeply intertwined, this is what we mean, right? And you can see here that one of the military's jets, the B-52, consumes about as much fuel in 1 hour as the average car driver uses in 7 years, right? So a lot of our conversations in the United States are focused on individual consumer choices around climate change, like you should take a shorter shower, you should, walk if you can, which is, fine, you should take a shorter shower, but that has absolutely no comparison to what the United States is currently spending on the military and the rate at which the weapons that the Pentagon deploys around the world are polluting our climate, right? And we have to be clear about that. But something else that's happening within the US media and around the world as we speak is that there's a concerted effort to use language about the climate crisis to quote unquote green the US military and really in the process shore up support for US militarism by greenwashing the military, right? So you can see at the top how the Department of Defense could help win the war on climate change. On the bottom, Mother Jones, ostensibly a progressive or liberal media outlet, 14 weird ways that the US military is becoming a clean green fighting machine, right? So there is this concurrent narrative that the US military can green itself, right? And we have to be able to speak back to that. And redirect the conversation to show that no amount of quote unquote greening the military will address the root of the problem, right? Which is twofold, that the US military itself is the single largest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, like I mentioned. And also, right, spending upwards of $750 billion on the Pentagon budget every year means that we are not using that money to address the real threat to national security, or, the actual threat to our entire livelihoods, which is the global climate crisis that will require international solidarity to adequately address, right? So we cannot continue down this road of US militarism as the only way that the way that the United States interacts with the international world community, right? So I think that's really important. Another thing is, if we're going to address climate change, we also have to address, and talk about a just transition from the fossil fuel and war economy. So up here, right, I talked a little bit about why CODEPINK itself is a feminist organization, right? Well, we also see that redirecting our tax dollars is a feminist cause, right? We can make the feminist case for cutting the Pentagon budget and redirecting our tax dollars into things that we actually need. So one of the largest myths that we hear whenever we talk to our representatives in the United States is the idea that high levels of Pentagon spending is justified because doing so creates jobs. We hear this all the time. We need that money. It'll create jobs in our districts, in our congressional districts. And I mean, that's true. I mean, spending on the Pentagon budget, of course, does create jobs, right? However, right, this statement is basically meaningless unless we place it into a larger context, which is that spending on almost any government agency obviously creates jobs. And importantly, if we compare spending on the Pentagon budget to spending on socially necessary programs, including healthcare, education, clean energy, then spending on the Pentagon budget actually means a net loss of potential jobs, right? So you can see that here, right? If you look at how many jobs spending on the military creates versus education for the same amount of money, you can see, right, very clearly why that argument is really important for us to forward. And, it's a feminist case for cutting the Pentagon budget because education, healthcare, these are industries that are dominated by women and people of color in the United States, right? And these are places where we could actually extend good paying jobs to those populations. And that's actually what we need. Instead of sending it directly to the Pentagon budget, which goes directly into private companies, which are more interested in padding their bottom line, right, than paying their workers a good wage. So we always have to keep that in mind whenever we're talking about this. One last thing I just wanted to mention before we pause to talk about any questions or any thoughts about this is that part of transitioning away from a war economy that's focused on endless consumption has to address the reality of something that we call the STEM to military industrial complex pipeline. So, the reality is that at our universities in the United States, they're often funded by the same private military contractors that make what we call make a killing on killing, right? And they actively recruit students who study the science, technology, engineering, and math track, which is called STEM, to work for them, right? So on the left, you can see a protest held by students and that CODEPINK supported, held at a university in the United States, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where students disrupted Raytheon at their school's career fair. So Raytheon showed up, the students were there to draw attention to what Raytheon actually does, despite their very glossy PR campaigns, where they want students just to think, oh, joining Raytheon, that means you're going to contribute to innovating and engineering the future, right? And the students at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo did a peaceful protest where they drew attention to the fact that Raytheon creates weapons of war. Raytheon weapons kill innocent people around the world. But I think it's also important for us to realize, and something that we want to focus on at CODEPINK as well, is that the STEM to military industrial complex pipeline starts well before people get into their university settings, right? Weapons manufacturers like Raytheon fund programs for young women to get involved in STEM at a young age, right? I mean, you can see these, this is like an engineering program or after school program, and you can see it's funded by Raytheon, right? And organizations, nonprofit organizations within the United States, like an organization called Girls Who Code, partner with Raytheon to run engineering and coding camps. And while it's great that young people can get involved in these science, technology, engineering, and mathematics at a young age, it's a problem that companies like Raytheon are able to set the terms of the conversation. And I think really importantly, set the terms of what's possible when we use science, technology, and math, right? They're saying, listen, get into this field, and what you're going to do with that is join Raytheon to create weapons of war, right? When what we should be doing is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics majors should be working to address what we actually need, which is climate change, right? We need their brains and their innovation in order to work on that, to create a society that we actually need rather than just creating more weapons of war. So we're also trying to look at that, but it's not easy, right? So I just, I prepped a couple of discussion questions. People might have thoughts or questions that are outside of the scope of this, but I did want to ask, because we're, international audience here, I want to know, like, how do people think we can connect to the call to cut the Pentagon to movements for justice around the world? Are there additional resources that would be helpful for an international movement to connect to cut the Pentagon as a call to action? So I just wanted to stop there and see if people had any thoughts or ideas before we move into the next part of our campaign work. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our Divest from the War Machine campaign, which brings some of our work into more of our local communities within the United States, at universities, within our cities specifically, and maybe even at our state level. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about that work. Does that sound good for right now to move on to that? Cool. Okay, great. All right, so let me share. This is the final presentation here. It shouldn't be too long. Hang on. Okay, great. So like I said, right, we have different campaigns at CODEPINK. We talked about our Cut the Pentagon work. So that's, the Pentagon budget is a national budget that's passed every year at the national level. So our Congress members pass that budget. But also something that's really important is we want to be able to bring and show people that the US war machine is actually a part of their everyday lives in the United States. And it's not just every year when we approve the Pentagon budget that we can actually work against funding for war in our local communities. So we have a Divest from the War Machine campaign at CODEPINK that works to divest invested assets from companies that profit from going to war. So, okay, what does that mean? Important sort of overview of some of the things that we look at in this campaign. So our Divest from the War Machine campaign is working to expose the role that war profiteers play in our day-to-day lives. Because, like I've mentioned, and we've talked a little bit about, right, companies like Raytheon and General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin, they engage in really slick PR campaigns, public relations campaigns, to obscure how they actually make a profit, which is by making a killing on killing, right? Every year they do. So, as you can see in this graphic, it's a little bit of a breakdown of how we see the US war machine operating to influence our politicians, our national budget priorities, and importantly, even in our local communities, right? And you can see it's a very cyclical process, right? So weapons manufacturers are the companies that produce the arms and technology that make wars possible, in the process making a large profit. They use those large profits to fund the campaigns of politicians, programs at educational institutions, like I mentioned, and much more. And politicians who are in part funded by these weapons manufacturers vote every year to extend existing wars, engage in new conflicts, and steadily increase the Pentagon budget. And underlying this entire dynamic, which is where our Divest from the War Machine campaign comes in, is the fact that large institutions like banks and asset managers invest heavily in these weapons manufacturers year after year. And that allows, if we continue the cyclical process, that allows weapons manufacturers to produce the arms and technology that makes them huge profit every year so they can fund the politicians, and the process goes on and on, right? And so obviously this analysis is not all encompassing, right? This is not all of the ways in which the US war machine operates within our society. But this is an important analysis for us because it also offers activists key points of intervention and ways to organize in their local communities against the US war machine, right? So in the United States, right, weapons manufacturers, they have their manufacturing plants and their offices located in cities around the country very deliberately because they want to place their manufacturing plants and their offices in different congressional districts in order to make sure that politicians also vote to increase their budget every year so politicians can say that they bring jobs to their district, right? And then the fact that weapons manufacturers can use their profits to donate to the campaigns of politicians means that we call on people to demand that their politicians stop taking those campaign contributions from weapons manufacturers. We can also use this as a way to organize at universities to talk about the ways in which their education is being funded by these weapons manufacturers. But then, and we've talked a little bit about the Pentagon budget already, but then the fact that institutions like banks and asset managers and pension funds, employee pension funds actually invest in these weapons manufacturers, well, that's also a place where we can start taking on the war machine in our local communities. So we have a couple of different resources for people that they can use to actually bring this campaign directly into their local communities. So we have the ability to develop institutional level divestment campaigns. So at the city level, at the state level, at the school level, which help to drive a new conversation, not only around divesting from the war machine, but also into socially responsible investment priorities in the United States. And we work to build local campaigns to divest, cities, states, and schools. And we have successful campaigns that have divested cities from weapons manufacturers. And we have example resolutions that people can pass at the city level, the local level. And we're working on campaigns at universities to divest university endowments from weapons manufacturers as well. So with that, I just wanted to, let me just time check here. Okay. I just wanted to go over a couple of specific tactics that we've used in some of our campaigns, just as a way to demonstrate that these campaigns, the end goal of the campaign is incredibly important, right? To divest from the war machine, divest from the companies that profit from war, incredibly important, right? But I also think it speaks to some of the conversations we've had up until this point, which is how do we get more people involved? How do we actually engage people in the work against the war machine, whether it's in the United States or around the world? And I think some of these tactics demonstrate that this campaign in particular can really bring that into people's local communities. So I'll demonstrate. So a key part of our campaign to divest from the war machine really begins by doing vital research and gathering information about whether or not our institutions actually are invested in war profiteers, right? This is not something that our cities or our universities or our states advertise. So we have to research that information and understand really the extent of those investments. And so the point in our campaigns where we're gathering investment information from an institution is essential, right? And for some, if somebody just came up to you and said, hey, can you help me research the investment information of our institution, right? That would be overwhelming, and it could feel very overwhelming. But the way that we've worked on our campaigns is this can actually present an opportunity to activate people to take action in a way that maybe they wouldn't otherwise, right? And also bring the idea that the US war machine is actually part of their everyday lives. Their institution is invested in it, making money on it. That's also an incredibly important part of this campaign. So looking up and gathering investment information can bring more people into action that otherwise would not have taken action. So I'll give you an example. This is a very obviously focused on a city here, Chicago. So in the beginning stages of our campaign to divest Chicago from the war machine, activists uncovered that the Municipal Employees Annuity and Benefit Fund of Chicago, which is the city level pension fund, which is how city workers will receive their retirement benefits. They found that they might have investments in the war machine. And when researching the city's website, they saw that this person, Steve Yoon, was the investment officer for this fund, for this benefit fund. And they reached out to him to try to access more information, right? After multiple emails, phone calls, and even a request from a staff member, from a local alderman, or like a city council member, Steve Yoon never responded, just ignored all of those requests, all of those calls, right? So this is what happened. Activists gathered to decide next steps and decided, right, this didn't have to be an obstacle, right? The fact that they weren't getting this information when they requested it didn't have to be an obstacle. In fact, it could be a way to engage people who signed up to learn more about our Divest from the War Machine campaign while we were doing some list building work, right? We talk to people all the time. Are you interested in learning more? This was a way to actively engage them, right? So activists created a call script and just a simple calendar and asked volunteers to sign up for a few days over a 2-week period until every day people were calling Steve Yoon's office asking for this investment information. And so finally, right, after sustained engagement from people and just calling every day, at least twice a day, finally they talked to someone in person who told them they needed to file what's called a Freedom of Information Act request to receive the investment records that they requested. So finally they had that, right? And instead of silence and uncertainty, right, this gave them a concrete next step. So with the help of an organization called Muckrock, dedicated to information transparency, activists filed a FOIA request and learned that the Municipal Employees Annuity and Benefit Fund of Chicago is in fact invested in weapons companies, right? So throughout this whole process, they were met with roadblock after roadblock, right? At first, they couldn't even get in contact with someone who was supposed to talk with them. Then they were told to file a very formal FOIA request, which can be very complicated. But finally, at the end of all of that, they were able to gather this information. And along the way, that meant bringing more and more people into the process and becoming part of this campaign and actually were invested in the outcome, right? So we're really excited because that campaign has now progressed to the point where just last week, actually, we had an alderman, which is a city council member in Chicago, who officially introduced our resolution to divest from the war machine into the Chicago City Council. So that would mean divesting actual funds from war profiteers in the city of Chicago. And so we're now working to generate support, but those are the co-sponsors of that resolution that have already been, signed on to this resolution. Now there are 50 aldermen in Chicago, so we're now working to get more and more aldermen on board. So this is incredibly important, right? I think there might be a question. Okay, never mind. Okay, so I'll just finish up, and this part is a little bit, I wanted to include this next section because I wanted to show how even people around the world can actually look into your own investment information. Maybe your city, your school, your local town might also be invested in weapons manufacturers, and you can actually use this to explore that. So I just, and relating to the conversation that we just had, right? These Divest from the War Machine campaigns can be long and definitely difficult, right? This campaign in the city of Chicago, it's taken 2 years to get to this point. I'm just like on the ground, like work and organizing to bring more people into the campaign. And so we try to celebrate wins when we have them, right? So transparency is a win. Getting access to that financial information was a huge undertaking. And when we finally got it, it allowed us to propel our campaign to the next level, and we, celebrate that. But then I wanted to talk a little bit about digging into investments. So, once people have access to the investments that their local institution might have, right? You have like the document. You have to be able to screen those investments for weapons companies, right? You have to understand, like, is your institution actually investing in these particular companies? And it can get a little complicated because there are direct and indirect investments. So what's important here is that CODEPINK has joined with an organization called As You Sow to develop a searchable database of commonly held mutual funds and ETFs to determine if your institution or your investments, your personal investments, are tied to weapons of war. So I'm going to go through what that looks like and what it means, right? And just as a note here, to track major military contractors, we use the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute Arms Industry Database. So that's where this information is being pulled from. So, okay. This weapons free fund database is an incredibly powerful tool because it enables everyone to do vital research to determine if your institution's investments are tied to the war industry. So let me just walk you through an example of what it would look like to search this database and understand the different elements that are present there, right? So let me just walk you through. So if we search the tool using the world's largest asset manager, BlackRock, maybe people here have heard of them, which CODEPINK has been targeting because it has billions of dollars invested in war and violence and climate change. Let's see what it would look like if we searched for BlackRock and tried to see what they're actually invested in, right? Okay. So when you search BlackRock, you'll come to a page that looks like this, right? And what you see here in red, that's circled, is that the weapons risk is considered high for all of these funds that BlackRock manages. So that means that every single one of the funds that's on the page that BlackRock manages is invested in weapons, right? And that's really important to know. So if you happen to know that your institution uses BlackRock to manage their investments, you would see that, oh, that means that our institution is using a company that invests in weapons manufacturers, right? So I'll just give you an example. The University of California system, one of the largest public university systems in the world, uses BlackRock as their investment manager. And so we know that the University of California system is invested in weapons manufacturers. So that's a lot of money because of how large the University of California system is. Okay, so next slide. So say you wanted to look more in depth at one of these funds that BlackRock is managing. Okay, so you click on one of those funds, right? And you'll see that each fund page looks like this with a more specific breakdown of what's actually contained within each of those funds, right? And you'll see that the fund that we clicked on, we just clicked on the first fund, right? This fund alone has millions invested in major military contractors, right? $1.68 million in the major military contractors, which is defined as the top 100 military contractors in the world. It has 1.1 million invested in nuclear weapons. And then it also has 500,000 invested in gun retailers, right? So this research tool, this search database, is really valuable because not only can you see the total number that is invested in, but you can also get a breakdown of the kinds of companies that it's invested in, right? And something that's really important here is you'll see this little icon next to the fund here. And this is to note that this fund has been deemed, quote, socially responsible. which is something we're trying to speak back to, right? Which is that you can't be invested in weapons of war and also be considered a socially responsible investment fund, right? If people know anything about BlackRock, you'll know that they try to sort of position themselves as a company that's concerned with, you know, investments and making sure that our investments are socially responsible, and yet they maintain billions of dollars invested in weapons manufacturers every year, right? So we want to speak back to that. So that is sort of how you use that weapons free fund, and I'm happy to answer any questions or thoughts about it. I just wanted to end by showing just a list of some of the resources we have on this campaign, which I'm always happy to send to anyone who is interested, and also talk with anyone who's interested about them. Maybe some of them won't be as applicable because, you know, this was obviously developed in a United States-based sort of context, but the weapons free fund can be used if you have any asset manager or any investment information from your institution. You can run it through the weapons free fund to see if they're invested in weapons manufacturers. We also have a list of companies to divest from that's just populated from the Stockholm Peace Research Institute. That's an important list to have if you're starting to talk about a divestment campaign at your institution. We have sample city council resolutions, again, for a very US-based context, but could be applicable in other contexts as well. And then, you know, to people's questions about how do we get young people and students involved, well, we've created a student activist guide to divestment, which not only outlines some of the things that we've talked about, but also how do you start a meeting? How do you build a list of supporters? What are some important pressure points at a university specifically, right? How can you go after university's donors and alumni, that kind of thing. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and see if there are any questions or thoughts.
One thing is a very concrete next step to be in touch with you. I mean, we can speak with you separately about it as well, but we are hoping to bring together a publication following this e-conference as WRI. So that was such an amazing presentation of your work and the issues that you're working on, why they are important. So it would be really interesting to put something like a written work together and publish on WRI website and some other publications as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We would be really thrilled to do that. I mean, the more, like I said, we can connect with people around the world, all the better. And same goes for us. You know, we publish a blog every day, and we also have a pretty significant platform on social media, et cetera. So if there are ways that we can bring attention to protests or any of your work or any of your resources, send them my way. We're always happy to do that. And, you know, I put my email in the chat box. So if anybody wants to talk more about how we can do that more deliberately, you know, together as more sort of deliberate coalition partners, always happy to chat.
Very good.
Great, thank you. It was very inspiring. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah.